evening, everyone, and welcome to this reading by Sara Majka Donal Ryan. My name is Alannah Hopkin. I'm a locally based writer of fiction, non-fiction journalism, literary critic, art critic, and short story writer. It's a great pleasure to be asked to do this, and it's really wonderful every year when the International Short Story Festival comes around. You discover new writers that you had never heard of before, and you get to meet writers that you already know and very much like. So here we are in a typical short story festival conjunction. Sara Majka's book, Cities I've Never Lived In, is an amazing collection of stories. Very fresh, very different, very intense, and very memorable. And I do urge you to buy a copy outside if you can, because it's not yet released in the UK territories. And if you don't buy it tonight, you'll have to order it from Amazon.com and pay all sorts of extra charges. So Sara is going to read first. So get it here. Can you still hear me down here?
Yeah.
Sara's going to read first, and I thought rather than write my own piece about her work, I'm just going to quote you from some of her rave reviews that you can find online at her website, which is saramajka.com. The collection was... Where's the New York Times gone? Yeah, this is the New York Times, and this is a first book, and this is pretty much a rave review, and one of its highlights says, Majka brings the reader to startling places. The stories feature an array of discomforting situations and hard-scrabble New England lives. All of the stories are sad. A father leaves his daughter with a neighbour and rents an apartment in another town. A mother meets up with the ex-husband who killed their daughter while driving drunk. A little girl is abducted from a church daycare and never seen again. Many of them are spooky. A young man leaves a mental hospital and finds that his island home has disappeared from the map. And this is another piece on cities I've never lived in. Fearlessly riding the line between imagination and experience, fact and fiction, the linked stories in Sara Majka's debut collection offer intimate glimpses of a young New England woman whose life must begin afresh after a divorce. Travelling the roads of Maine and the train tracks of Grand Central Station, moving from vast shorelines to the unmade beds of strangers, these 14 stories circle the dreams of a narrator who finds herself turning to storytelling as a means of working through the world and of understanding herself. Another review said, these stories are a marvel and will break your heart. And I very much agree with that. Sara is particularly good at evoking the experience of those moments where life becomes so intense you think you're going to crack up, but somehow you get through it. And as biography, what we have here is when she was young, Sara Majka's family moved along the New England coast, living in Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Maine, and even for a time in a lighthouse. She received graduate degrees from UMass-Amherst and Bennington College and was awarded a fellowship at the Fine Arts Work Centre in Provincetown. She now lives in Queens with her young son. Cities I've Never Lived In is her first book. Over to you, Sara.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for that. Thank you to the festival and Patrick. I was telling people I always have this true fear that I'll read really long, so I'm going to time myself. I'm going to read the shortest story in my collection, I think it is, so that I should be able to get through the whole thing. It's called Nashua, and it's a traveling story, which is fitting, I think. When I travel, I often visit another town nearby, someplace I wouldn't otherwise go. And the sound's okay? Mm-hmm. Nashua, I think, was like that. It was after Christmas, and I was watching for a time a teenager and 2 dogs for a family west of Boston. I rarely saw the teenager except to drive her from place to place, but I let the dogs out and walked them and picked up the garbage they had strewn about. I cooked meals I found in the freezer, shrimp, individual-sized lasagna. The house was large enough that cleaning people came every few days, and when I couldn't find something, I always thought that the cleaning people had moved it when I'd probably just forgotten where it was. One night I drove to an old unheated cinema to watch a musical. It involved driving unknown roads in the snow and then driving back, hoping I would find the teenager at home, chasing the dogs, trying to get them in their cages. There was, as always, the relief of living within a life that wasn't mine, of raising the heat and walking barefoot across the bathroom stone floor. Around this time, I realized I had fallen in love again, this time with a man who was a drinker. I remembered a story by Alice Munro in which a woman, sensing she is falling in love and fearing what had happened the other times, gets in a car and starts to drive and just keeps going. It was a snowy day when I thought about this, and I sat in my bedroom and imagined just waiting it out, how long it might take. Outside there was a scrape of shovels. But for what other reason are we alive, I thought. That day I had driven to Nashua from Boston to look for farmhouses. I was researching abandoned farmhouses and wanted to find a part of New Hampshire with both rural and urban poverty. Once there, I bought a bottle of whiskey at the tax-free shop, then found the Salvation Army. I bought fabric for curtains and asked the woman behind the register for directions, but she knew the roads by different numbers than were listed on my map. As I drove the hills, the sun hit low across an apple orchard, and it was so striking that it didn't surprise me to see an abandoned farmhouse just like that, just what I was searching for at the top of the hill. I pulled over and started to walk. There was a neighborhood watch sign nailed to a tree, and I thought of the neighbors watching me in the snow. Through the window, I saw furniture, not arranged to make the room habitable, but grouped together as if to be taken away. It wasn't a beautiful farmhouse, or I would have felt the desire to go inside. I was glad the desire was less than it might have been. Still, it was hard to leave, and below the hills, I stopped at a church. The door to their second-hand shop opened, but the woman inside said that it was closed, that I'd have to come back the next day. There was a time in my life when several poets I knew gave me their poems, and one man who I didn't think was a very good poet otherwise gave me one that I still have. He wrote about being in a hotel in France and never going out, and overhearing the woman in the neighboring room telling her lover about him, saying that seeing him was like seeing a man at the end of a long tunnel. Some people I took the poem to mean are lost already. I thought of this poem when I went to Poland to find the village my grandparents had emigrated from. I never made it to the village and instead stayed a week in a small hotel off a village square, and I would sit in the window and smoke and watch pigeons. In the afternoon, I'd go out for a donut and a cup of tea and walk around until it was time for an early dinner, and then I'd return to the hotel to read and drink from bottles of wine I'd purchased near the train station. I cried some nights as I wanted a child back then, and I was almost past the point of being able to have one. I imagine that's why I was in Poland, because I wanted time to think about these things, such as this man and the poem he had written, and the little girl I might not be able to have. Seeing a ghost, having your own ghost, being the man at the end of a long tunnel, makes you into a ghost too, separates you from the people around you. This town in Poland turned out to be a destination for school children, as Copernicus had once lived there, and his house had been made into a museum. The children came in packs. The streets near the museum were narrow and stone and winding, and I would come upon them, 15 or 20 children in their winter coats, and always 1 or 2 tall, thin women behind them. They would pass, and I'd spend the rest of the afternoon walking, sometimes stopping at a cafe to write a letter. I was thinking of Warsaw, of going back to Warsaw, of avoiding the reconstructed city and instead walking the old streets outside of the center. Though I feared I was falling in love with that man, the one that was a drinker, little happened between us. The nights we were around each other would softly fade out. He wore all spring, winter, and fall a caramel-colored wool coat with a belt around the middle. He was tall, with brown hair he kept at his chin, but it was the coat that you remembered. I once, when waiting to board a bus, stood behind an older black woman, and her coat was a lot like Ansel's. She looked as if she had owned it her whole life. "Where'd you get your coat?" I asked Ansel once. We were drinking midday next to the window in an otherwise dark bar. He waved his hand in the air as if to say, "Who knows?" The sun came in and I touched the wool. The question dropped in the way most did back then. Not that the effort wasn't worth it, but that the moment had changed and the question wasn't there anymore. Perhaps much of what drew us together was the way life felt to us. My memory was poor. I had developed the habit of writing the names of things in a notebook. I put off doing this as I worried it would become obsessive, but it got so that I couldn't remember much anymore. I couldn't remember, for instance, the name of a movie that had touched me. A friend had screened a beautiful art film with footage of a snowy cabin north of New York. It alternated with shots of the city. Afterwards, I couldn't recall any of it. Or another time, I was talking to a student and asked if he had seen Sans Soleil. And then, seeing nothing register in his face, I asked in a flurry, "But that's a movie, yes?" As if I'd become worried it was a cleaning product. Ansel's memory changed too. When I was with him, I knew he'd remember the moments differently the next day, but there was no way to know in what way, or what his consciousness, when drunk, what that felt like. I thought of that forgotten art film with the clicking of the reel, of the lights flickering at the end of the moment when those two films played over each other. Okay. One night, after being at a bar with Ansel, I dropped him off at his apartment and he tripped on the stairs going up. It was painful to watch, so I looked away. I drove from there to a diner on the corner that had recently opened and sat with a cup of tea. The waitress kept asking if I was okay. She was a kind girl whose parents were from India. She had the overnight shift, 13 hours. Few people came in during those hours, and fewer people were likely to come, as the owner, she told me, had fired the night cook earlier that week. Ansel had wanted me to tell him about the diner, so I paid careful attention and tried to think of what I would say. I would say it was a desperate thing being there. At a certain point, I started to cough, bent over at the table. I must not have looked well. I hadn't taken my coat off. The waitress had teased out the jobs I held, and they weren't bad jobs. She must have wondered what had brought me to such a place at 3 a.m. I never understood why Ansel drank like that. He'd drink until he was falling down. In a sense, I was magnetized, drawn in, and he probably knew that. It seemed the cruelest thing to ask, so I never did, but I wondered if he knew that he did it, and if so, if he had some understanding about why. For some reason, I had his apartment in my imagination, in the sense that I was able to picture it even though I had never been inside. We used to describe things to each other, stuff about our furniture, the style of blankets we used, the layout, how we had set things up. There was one night, and all the time I knew him, when I went home with him. I thought I knew the trade-off I was making, but I later learned that I was wrong, that I hadn't known what would happen, or what it would feel like to be inside his apartment, or even what his apartment would look like. After that, we rarely saw each other. It happened slowly. At first because he avoided me, and then later because it was too difficult, almost impossible, to have a drinker like that in your life. That summer, my mother visited me in the city. We were walking down the street when a man who looked like Ansel walked by. I said his name once, twice, and then, just when I was about to give up, my mother said his name more sharply. Still, he didn't turn. At the stoplight, he rounded the corner, and I walked out into the street to try from there, but this man held his body so that I never saw his face. Later, I decided it was both him and not him. My mother would sometimes bring it up. She wanted me to ask him, but since I felt both versions were true, there was nothing to learn from asking. It was a way to hold something, the memory of him, lightly enough so that all possibilities were true, and to not crush anything by asking, if I loved him or not, and if I loved him, trying to understand why. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Majka. Now, Donal Ryan. I think most people will be familiar with the name. His biography as a writer reads a bit like a fairy tale, discovered on the slush pile, enormous success of first book, and then good success of second book, then a collection of stories which we're going to hear from tonight. His first novel, The Spinning Heart, was the Book of the Year at the Irish Book Awards 2012, longlisted for the Man Booker and the Guardian First Book Award. Shortlisted, second was shortlisted for the Kerry Group Irish Novel of the Year. This has become the way now to describe a writer's career. It's a sort of shorthand, rather than saying he's an amazingly interesting writer who has brought hitherto hidden voices to the front in contemporary Irish literature. His writing, gives voices to people that are just not usually heard, including travellers, the rural labouring men, workers in care homes, and also he sometimes uses topical news stories as a starting point from which to take off. There are examples of these in the collection A Slanting of the Sun, from which Donal will now read. Thank you.
I'm going to read a story called Trouble, which is also the shortest story in my collection. So it's about, I think, 10 minutes of reading. And Trouble, the narrator is a traveller girl of about 11, so it shouldn't be too hard to enter the fictive dream and imagine me as an 11-year-old traveller girl. The ways of some things are set like the blueness of the sky. The day I learnt that started with a hunt for a coil pack for the Vectra that wasn't even needed for a finish. Daddy priced one new, and it was poison dear, so he told your man to go shite. Oh, I have to say actually, before I go on, because people become offended sometimes. There's quite a lot of bad language in this. I'd forgotten actually until I got to the hotel room here, because I've been on the road a lot, and I practiced it and realised, oh God. A few bad words, and I do still hear my grandmother on my right shoulder going, don't make a show of us. And also I read a story like this a few years ago in Dún Laoghaire, and a lady said, you're a disgrace to your parents and to Ireland. So if you feel that way afterwards, please don't tell me. Then Daddy rang his cousin in Long Pavement to know had he won, and he hadn't. And Daddy rang around a few more lads he knew that had bits of scrappers lying around for breaking, and there wasn't a coil pack to be got. So for a finish, he gave in and rang Curly's, even though he can't bear them. He said to your man on the phone, if I give you €100 for it, and it turns out not to be what's wrong, will you take it back off of me? And your man said on the phone that he would. Come on, daughter, he said to me over his shoulder, as he swung into the cab of his lorry. Come with me for the spin. And of course, the Vectra still wouldn't start, even with the coil pack that was got from Curly's. The Curly's have acre upon acre of scrappers. I'd love a day let free in there. There's no way in though, barred through the front office. They have the whole place walled off, like Limerick prison, for fear people would be lifting stuff. They have forklifts and all in there for piling cars on top of each other. They have a fleet of breakdown lorries and a transporter. There's a million cars in there. Daddy says, God be with the days a man could give a wander about with his wrench set and get what he wanted and pay the man and go away. Besides sitting in a plastic chair in a waiting room like a man waiting for a doctor. Reception area me whole, Daddy says. It's far from reception areas, the Curly's were rare. I think Daddy had a run-in with a Curly or two in the old days. When we went back the second time that morning to Curly's, and Daddy gave his receipt in through the hatch and laid the coil pack down on the ledge in front of the hatch, I knew straight away there'd be trouble. I just had a feeling, a burning in my belly. Daddy was like a lunatic as it was, because he had his hands skinned 2 or 3 times in the swapping in and out of coil packs and starters new and old and in between, and still the Vectra only coughing at him when he tried to get it going. Your man held up the receipt in front of him, and his glasses was half the way down his nose, and Daddy said, "Jesus, you're doing great examinations of it. It's not so long since you've seen it last, only 2 or 3 cups of tea ago." "Do you think," your man says slowly, smartly, "that we dismantle cars here for the good of our health?" Well, if he did. Daddy backed back a step, so he was only a kick of my leg from where I was sitting. I heard his breaths heave down his nose. "Give me back 90, so," says Daddy in a low voice, real even, "and we'll call it quits. That's a tenner clear for the minute it took your monkey outside to unscrew it. That's 600 fucking euros an hour. Nice work, if you can get it, pal." Your man still his head leaned back, and he was baldy on top and curly at the sides. Was he a curly, I wonder? A person's name often described him bang on. And his glasses were still half the way down his snout. But he was examining Daddy now instead of the receipt, and he said, "How's about we give you a credit note?" And Daddy did his closed mouth, no smile, nose breath laugh that he does always at the start of trouble, and said, "How's about you keep your word, or 90% of it?" And your man said no. And Daddy said, "Okay, how's about I drag you out here over the counter and wipe that fucking floor with you?" And he pointed behind him at the floor, and a woman that was waiting for a catalytic converter for a 206 for a look, and her eyes were kind of wide. And it was then that I saw that she kind of had the look of Mary Margaret, my sister, who I love the bones of, who's gotten married and gone to England, and I haven't seen her for a long time. Then your man said, "Right," and disappeared, and Daddy stood looking in through the hatch your man had closed and bolted with his 2 hands hanging, and it changing from fists to hands and back to fists in time with the ticking of the clock. Daddy swung round from the hatch. "What says that?" And he pointed at a sign beside the other hatch in the far wall. "Garda, traffic, corpse," I read out. "Core," the 206 woman said. "Ha," I nearly said. She smiled at me, and I remembered just in time to say, "Pardon." She had the look of Mary Margaret, for sure and certain. "What about the P and the S?" I said to her. "They're silent," she told me. "What's the point of having them there so?" I said. And she nodded and kind of laughed. "It's a French word," she said. "It means," and she wrinkled her eyes in thinking, "branch, like they are the branch of the guards that deals with traffic. This is where towed away cars are kept, until their owners pay their fines and collect them." "Oh," I said, and stayed looking at her a bit too long. But she didn't see me. She was turned back around again to her magazine. Then I noticed how worried looking Daddy was after getting. But he listened all the same to the woman explaining to me about the French P and the French S, and he nodded at her to say thanks, I'd say, for being so kind as to teach me something. Daddy is mad for education for me, having had none of his own. Your man was gone a good long while. There was trouble on the way, I knew. Daddy was in an awful predicament. He wasn't going leaving his 90 euros to the curly so we couldn't bear. Your man had the coil pack took back from the ledge. Daddy was after threatening violence, and there was a witness. Kind as she was, and as like Mary Margaret, she would hardly lie to the shades for us. Daddy has a record as long as his 2 arms, from before he met Mammy, and she made him promise to be good. He nearly always kept his promise, and when he didn't, it was only because he was left with no choice. Trouble found him sometimes, no matter that he'd done his level best to keep out of the path of it. There was no knowing where your man was gone, or what he was doing, or who he was gone ringing. There was no knowing was there shades in behind them doors, or if they were close by, bringing in clamped cars. Probably they'd have lads that weren't shades doing that though. But surely that hatch would be manned by shades for the taking of money off people that was after getting towed. I knew Daddy would be having the exact same thoughts as me. Your man arrived back, and another lad with him, older and fatter and baldier with no curls. "No refunds," he says, "unless the part is faulty." "This man said," Daddy started to say, pointing at the original fella, but the new lad cut him off and said in a voice not far off a shout, and a little space between each word, he said he'd take it back. "Yeah," Daddy said, and nodded, and his shoulders relaxed a small bit. "And he has it taken back," the new lad said, "and he will give you a credit note in exchange towards your next purchase." "My next purchase!" Daddy was all tensed up again, There was a redness rising up along his neck. My next purchase. Sure, you'll hardly still be here when hell freezes over, will you? Robbing, stealing, lying, dirty fuckers as all the curlies ever was. The curly lad and the fat lad just stood looking, and for a finish the fat lad said, I'll be sure to pass on your feedback to them. And they both started to laugh, horrible laughs, and the redness on Daddy's neck darkened, and the burning in my belly got more and worse, like a fire turned to explosion, like a car that was after getting torched will burn and then blow. The lady with the look of Mary Margaret turned again and lifted up her magazine and showed me a picture of a huge big lady lying on a couch with one big enormous leg stretched bare out from her along the couch and the other on the ground, and underneath the picture it said, Britain's biggest woman looking for love. The lady was smiling and holding the magazine up beside her face, the very same as if there was no trouble in that room, and looking straight at me in an expecting kind of way. What do you think of her? She asked, and laughed again. Her laugh was like a lovely engine, tuned perfect and just ticking over, revved nice and gentle. And just as I kind of knew would happen, without knowing I knew, Daddy went apeshit and tried to bust in through the glass of the hatch, and the two lads hightailed it, and glass smashed, and the shades came in all yellow and blue. And when I chanced to look out of one eye, they were all lying on the floor, except for one shade who was standing up, looking down, and Daddy was roaring from underneath the small mountain of arms and legs that he was going killing every fucking curly there ever was. The lady with the look of Mary Margaret put her hand over mine and drew me towards the door, and we stood outside it while the held Daddy down by an arm or a leg each, which was easy enough to do, as by then he'd come back to himself a little bit, and he was going to be careful not to make his record stretch down too much farther than his two arms. Come on, the lady said, come on with me. She told the spare prick of a shade, who did all the looking and none of the holding down of Daddy, that she was with me. Daddy was cuffed and quietened, and he was saying, okay, go handy. I swear I'll go and leave this place in peace, and I'll pay for the broken window and all, and I'm sorry for the trouble. If you let me go now, there'll be no more trouble from me. I swear on the dead Martins. Them shades knew to a man who was the dead Martins. Still and all, they carried him off to a paddy wagon. Sometimes I look at Daddy, at the side of his face or his back, and I love him so much that it feels like he's a prize I won for doing something brilliant, better than anyone else. There's no way in hell you're ever going to hear them words from my mouth though. Thinking them words is enough. God hears all and knows all, and not all things need saying. I hated seeing him being dragged and he all upset, but he isn't stupid, and I knew he'd behave himself once the explosion was over. The shades probably would even deliver him home to our house, or back to Curly's yard for his lorry, and Mammy would meet him at the door with a slap and a kiss. The lady's car smelled plasticky and new. Janie Mac, she said, that was scary, wasn't it? Are you okay, love? Fear of me, I told her. She asked did I want a sweet, and then something remembered itself in my head, something about strangers and sweets, and never getting into a car with a person not known to you. But she was pretty, and she smelled so nice, and even the shade with his hands hanging had only nodded and smiled at her as she'd walk me out past the trouble with my hand in hers. She was looking at me and smiling, and she admired my converses, and I admired her hair, and she asked where I lived, and I told her Alannah Hopkin. And she looked a bit confused and said, what? In a house? And I said, what the fuck else would I live in? And straight away put my hand over my mouth and asked God to forgive me for cursing, but only in my mind. Do you not live in a... Have you ever lived in a what? I was right interested now. I'd never met a mad person before. Only Daddy when trouble come round, but that's a different sort of mad. A caravan. I thought of the fire barrel in the backyard that Daddy would set ablaze the very odd night, and him and his pals would stand around it and talk and shout and laugh, and curse at the sky if a helicopter passed. A campfire is legit, I heard a man say once, so they can fuck off. Part of culture and custom. It's rubbish fires is illegal. And how the fuck would you know the difference? Another man said, from way up there. And the first man was leaping at his own thickness, and the other man's smartness, but was trying not to show it, while his comrades laughed and laughed. And my daddy done his best to keep peace around the barrel, saying, Jimmy is right, campfires are grand, and they know by the size and the smoke and the ring of men around it standing, that it's not rubbish is being burnt, but wood. Them lads have special cameras to see what's far away, even through the dark of night. My daddy doesn't drink anymore, and so his temper doesn't leave him as quick, and he can only square up to a man who he thinks can match him, and only if that man has done him wrong. like the lad in Curly's with his credit note. So he's a great one now for keeping peace between people. That's kind of his job, I think. I thought travellers, as a rule, lived in caravans, the lady said. I heard loads of things, true and untrue, said for certain about me since that day, and never a trace of doubt in the sayers' voices, but said in a way that made you know the person saying it believed something about you, even though they had no right in all the world to that belief. But that first time pierced me sharpest and so deep. I'd never heard words said like that before, words that took my sameness away and left me kind of sorry to be me. The lady put the back of her hand against my cheek, where a tear I hadn't felt coming suddenly was, and then the palm of that hand on my head, and I saw her look down at her hand for just a taste of a second, and a flash of something like worry visited her face and disappeared again as quick. Then she rubbed the two sides of that hand against the edge of her seat, and she didn't know I seen her do it, because I know in my heart and soul she didn't even know she was doing it. She talked more, but I didn't really listen, wanting to know had I gone to see Finding Nemo, and I just nodded. And she drove me back the road to our house, and every car that came against us, I felt like the people was all looking at me, and I felt open on the two sides of me, and like I shouldn't be in that car at all. So I sort of hugged myself to tighten myself into as small a size as I could. I asked her to drop me at the end of our road, and I jumped out of her car without barely saying goodbye, and ran up to Mammy to tell her about Daddy and the Curlies and the Shades, but never breathed a word about the lady, because there were no words to say what happened, just a feeling I couldn't even name. Even though I've grown since then, and will for a good few years to come, until I'm 18 or 19, I'll never again walk as tall as I did before that day, before that lady looked at me, and divided and shrunk me, and wiped me off of herself, without even knowing she was doing it. And she never thinking for a second she was anything but kind. The ways of some things are set, like the courses of rivers, or the greenness of grass, or the trouble that follows my daddy, or the hard light of knowing in people's eyes.
So, two very contrasting stories it would seem, yet I think there are perhaps more similarities between them than on the evidence of that reading. Do you agree?
I'm not sure. I know when you did the introduction and you said that, you know, you wrote about hard scrabble people.
Yes.
I thought my book has a lot of that too. But outside of that, probably not so much. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I think we all there's a very narrow kind of band of themes really, and there's a very small amount of stories that we kind of all retell and repackage in different ways over and over again. And we're all kind of on about love in some way, but it's different permutations. It's kind of the basic theme of all fiction, I think.
Love. And perhaps the transformation of lived experience into story is something you both share. Though you've both read slightly untypical stories, so all my generalizations are undermined. But
I listened to your voice and you're telling the story, and then towards maybe halfway, 2/3 point, you started to add reflection, and so I tend to do reflection almost all the way through. So I enjoyed watching how you kind of shaded into reflection.
What would the reflection be? The internal comment on the story?
Yeah.
Were you aware of that?
No, because I'm a very bad planner, and if something kind of reads kind of coherently at the end, I think, it's fine, it's grand, But I must say, there's a thing that's just has occurred to me a lot lately, and it was actually a theme of a story I was going to read about that idea of a thing having every possible result, and it seems to me something very fundamental, and it's very beautiful that the way it's put in your story about, it was him and wasn't him. And it seems even now it's actually fundamental to existence, because it's like a particle, it can be a wave or a particle, it's like in its every position until it's observed. It seems you're striking at something very fundamental to existence there.
Absolutely.
Just something like that. Actually, I was on a plane reading about
Yeah.
Science magazine.
And I wonder how you reacted to my comment that you're very good at conveying the experience of life on a knife's edge. You know, there are moments in many of the stories where the leading character is almost in meltdown, but somehow carries on.
I want to have thoughts about that, so I'm thinking.
Good. I know it's a difficult one, maybe it's just something I picked
It is
up
a
on,
difficult one.
Not many people do that.
Well, I've always struggled answering questions like that and not going personal, because why is one interested in writing something like that without having a personal feelings about it? Rather than talking about myself, I usually shuffle it over a little bit to talk about New Englanders and the sort of New England I wanted to capture, and that's easier territory to talk about. And so I am drawn to teetering people. That tension draws me in. My book has a lot of the narrator thinking about poverty, talking about it in the characters, and I think that it's that same edge. That same edge is something that I'm drawn to.
And similarly, Donal, where do you find the voice of this traveller girl?
Well, actually, I lived that experience. I was in a scrapyard once and I had bought an alternator for a car, and I was told I could bring it back, and it was a bit of a tete-a-tete. I don't often get in fights with scrapyards, but it happens now and again. But on the same day, I twisted it a bit now. On the same day, I saw a traveller family in the scrapyard reception area, and I heard a woman say at one stage, who was waiting for a part for a car, they shouldn't be allowed. And I don't know to what she was referring, whether it was the children being loud or running around, or travellers in general. But I know that there are people who actually do believe that travellers shouldn't be allowed, because I think, we all carry prejudices with us, but there is a snobbery at a very cellular level in Ireland, a real division. And for some reason it's becoming more stark instead of less stark. Yes. I don't know why that is, but social division, people will emphasise their class now. They'll tell you in a conversation, I'm middle class.
Really?
I'm middle class, don't mistake me for a working class person, Which I find amazing, I really find amazing,
By referring to what they own? Or
by saying straight out I'm middle class.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and I'm always amazed at hearing these words, and it's fine, it's totally fine to be proud of what you are, I'm always amazed by it.
What circles do you open?
Same as everybody else, I have an ordinary job, an ordinary life.
Well, what is travellers in Ireland?
Yeah, they're like gypsies, really. They're a nomadic people. It's kind of a peripatetic existence, I'm not silly about travellers. If a van put up outside my house with 5 young traveller boys in it, I would be nervous, but probably it'd be fine. I know lots of travellers. There's problems in their society, but there's just massive prejudice against them. It's like every traveller is bad until you can prove without doubt that he's good.
It's interesting too that I have a story called Travellers too, but I didn't know in Ireland it had such a concrete definition.
Which was a very interesting story, as I recall.
I'm trying to recall it.
Was that the one where the father? No, that's
the one with the girl that gets taken from daycare.
Oh yes. It's near the end. Yeah. Well, perhaps we'll throw this open to the floor. Please ask anything you'd like of either of our writers, or both of them. Did you find some sort of similarity in these very different stories in some way? There's some.
I'll ask you a question because I always ask questions. I don't really know much about either of your collections, to be honest, but I read a little bit about them, and I was thinking about the role of care, the idea of care in both of your stories, and I wanted to talk a bit about this.
Care as in looking
Well, I
after...
think that's up to the writers to answer.
I was just trying to elucidate what you meant by care.
I think they can.
Okay.
I can't, sorry.
Well, now I'm interested in that. If the word care even would have a different connotation here than it would to me. A lot of the book I think the narrator has that desire to care for people and to have a little baby to care for. So that's what I think of when you ask that.
Like looking after.
Yeah, something to care for. It's a little bit of a bleak book, and so I think the desire in my book for something to care for, something, you know.
I'm not really exactly sure what you mean by care, Joanna. Do you mean like, are you referring to the actual people who provide care professionally in the book?
The word.
In fact, the title story is set in a...
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, there's kind of perversions of care in my book, really.
Yes.
I mean, the first story is about a young man who falls into wildly inappropriate love, you know, and there are actual care workers in the book as well, who don't provide care in the exact way it should. And I feel actually a little bit of a cheat when it comes to a certain story that was based on a news story. It's still rumbling on in the news because it was kind of written for me. You know, I was in the car going to the airport and I heard a guy talking about these people who were paid to provide care, and as we all know, it went horribly wrong. And he described these people as they would be, he reckoned, when it came to light who they were. He described the kind of life they'd have, profiled them basically. And I was fascinated by his presumptions, and actually based a short story on what he said in radio. I should credit the guy, but I didn't get his name, so it's fine. But it's always there. I mean, it's like, you know, these things are all intermixed. I mean, we all want to be cared for, and we want to care for people, and things can go so horribly wrong. That's where fiction comes in. It's like Kurt Vonnegut abandoned short stories because he said they're so unnatural. You know, I don't feel this unnaturalness, but I do know what he means, kind of. You know,
What is it?
if you want to write about care and you want to write a short story and you study, you know, what a short story is, and you try to bend the story about care or love or anything else into 3,000 words, it's not going to be natural, because narrative itself isn't natural, even though we seem to really need it as a species, you know.
I was thinking, because I was listening to the earlier Q&As, so that had me thinking about novels versus short stories. And so I've tried with novels because I'd like to, you know, to write one. The question in the earlier Q&A was what draws you to the short story form, and I was like, you know, nothing originally. I read novels, that's all I knew when I was a little girl. I wanted to write a novel when I grew up, you know, and it turned out my personality. It is very natural for the story. I'm brief, you know, and it's a lot of my writing life has been, you know, just trying to accept that, and you know, now more and more I read short stories more and more. I love the form, and I found that especially with young writers and new writers, you know, I grew up reading the classics, so I can be very judgmental as a reader. And I notice with a young or new writer, often if I find out it's a collection of stories, I'll be more likely to pick it up because I think the quality will be better, because they haven't taken out the larger project of a novel that's going to involve a lot of heavy lifting, and I get frustrated reading all that, like spackling and lifting with someone who hasn't quite mastered the form of a novel, or the story might feel more naturally them. Yes.
Yeah, definitely agree. Yeah, absolutely.
And people have often commented that, particularly your first novel, is almost like a series of stories.
Yeah.
Though it's very cleverly interwoven.
I never thought that way.
With a spinning heart.
They're all monologues, but
yeah.
none of them could quite stand alone, you know.
No, it's the interplay of the voices and the things you learn from different angles, different voices. But I think the voice is very central to your writing.
Yeah, definitely. But I totally agree with Sarah about, I mean, the novel form. Mike McCormack is a great writer, and he's a short story writer and a novelist. He says the novel offers a wonderful accommodation that's not found in short stories, you know. But that accommodation itself can become a negative because you can end up taking too much advantage of it, you know, and going kind of a bit too wrong. Whereas a short story, it has to be pretty much pristine, you know, you can't afford to go too far wrong with it because there's no cover, there's nowhere to hide.
I like your metaphor of heavy lifting in the novel.
Yeah.
And do you write longer pieces? Like long stories?
I always think I'm writing a novella, and then I start edit it, I start trying to make it better, through that editing process, and it becomes 7 pages. And it's not a joke that I'll be like, this is a novel, and then by the end of it, it really will be 7 pages.
You could call distillation.
yeah, that's. I think most of my work is done through that process.
Yeah.
There's a question behind the pillar.
Oh, sorry.
Online.
Why are you meant to?
Yes, I can't see you.
I haven't read Sarah's stuff actually, but I've read Donal Ryan's 2 novels and short stories. Donal Ryan is supposed to be called a hurling man from Nenagh maybe, but anyway. No, just on just one on the question here maybe. I don't want to be speaking. It's just my own opinion. The idea, Donal, you have of compassion, I think, for people really, I think you have a real feel for that. I think I've seen quite a bit of the theme of bullying in your stories.
Yeah.
That the novel, which one was it, but that young fellow who was dressing up for the dance and the parents were so happy.
Ron Johnsy, yeah.
What's his name?
Johnsy.
Johnsy, the farmer, yeah. And then he just found that he was ridiculed and made nothing of there, And I noticed at the end of your last story as well, the way that girl was shamed and made into nothing, I think, I was a teacher myself, in case you haven't guessed, but, bullying was something I felt strongly about. That went on,
I'm kind of obsessed with bullying actually, really. It's through my whole life I've been obsessed with bullying and bullies and people who are bullied.
Yeah.
And I've kind of managed to largely avoid it myself, but I mean we all drag damage from school. No one leaves school undamaged, We all see things going on or have things done to us or and I met teachers who were bullies, I met students who were bullies, I saw people getting horrible, I saw teachers being bullied, the full gamut really. I went to the Christian Brothers wild place.
In the stories you really understand the effects of bullying and the techniques employed.
I spent 15 years in civil service really being the bullier of bullies, really. I took it on myself to take on bullies all the time and bring them down. I actually made bullies cry. It was a big achievement for me. I became a bully myself actually, but I just think I'm only bullying bullies, so it's fine. Actually, just on Donal Ryan, there's a hurler from Limerick called Donal Ryan from Garryspillane, and we look very alike. Actually, all Donal Ryans tend to look alike. We're all bald, and we all have the same basic shape of face and body. But I used to work as an inspector, labour inspector, and I'd go to companies in Limerick and they go, "Jeez, Donal, how's it going? How will it go this year?" And everything's very easy. I get all the accounts, everything will be laid out for me because it's all the county hurler. I just played along with it, it was fine. But you're right about Donal Ryan. I'm called Donal Ryan usually. But
I know, I'd be surprised if the week that's in it, if there wasn't
that's why I've been horse actually.
Maybe one hour in Tipperary,
Yeah.
But no, I think you're not one bit afraid to look at the badness of people really and of evil, and I think it's maybe not looked at.
Yeah, I think I get a bit obsessed with evil, alright.
Yeah,
Was that why you became a lawyer?
I was never actually a lawyer. No, the Irish Times put this about it. I was a lawyer.
That's where I got from too, yes. Once it's in the Irish Times, you're stuck.
Yeah, my job was to prosecute employers who didn't fulfil their obligations. So I have a law degree, so I suppose I practiced in a way.
Like
I was never actually, yeah.
Sorry, I must be looking out for questions, yes.
No, I agree with that man. It's a question to Donal Ryan. There's great tenderness and empathy and understanding in your writing. And it can be desperately dark and sad, and Johnsy, that character in particular, I think it made me cry. And also, I don't think I'd ever fully understood the effect of bullying until I read that fully. But I also think what makes it bearable is that you have a great comic sense as well. And you interject these very dark moments with something very funny.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it bearable. And that's what I really enjoy in what you write. But even tonight, I haven't read your short stories yet, but I was really struck by that line that just randomly thrown in there about the lady, the article she was reading. I was listening, it was a very serious moment, and all of a sudden we hear about the largest woman in England looking for love. And I was just wondering, have you always had this natural comic sense? Does it come very naturally to you?
Yeah, from my parents really actually.
Feel for it.
My parents are just hilarious, and they can tell you a story about a devastating story about utter misery and moral bankruptcy, and it can just be hilarious. And they won't even mean it to be hilarious; it just will be. It's just the way. It's literally the way they tell it.
Sometimes you need the two, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, my mum works in Tesco's on the till, and she listens to people's stories all day. Actually, like there's a queue at my mum's till in Tesco's about 40 long all the time, and the other tills will be empty, and there'll be a manager saying, "Come over to the other tills," because they know I want to talk to Anne, because people want to tell her things. Now, I'm not saying I use this or that she passes stuff on, but she just generally relays
You
things.
obviously soaking it up.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
But that line even tonight, I was just wondering afterwards, it was so random. How long did you have to think about it?
Oh, if I think I'm finished, really. If I think,
So it just pops into your head,
yeah, pretty much.
and you know it's going to work.
If I think really, it just doesn't work, yeah. If I think before I write, it just ends up being forced and contrived and weird and it doesn't feel right and I feel a little bit sick in my stomach. So I know this. Do you find that, Sarah? Yeah.
Do you write off
If you
on
overthink.
instinct? Yeah.
Because I've heard John Boyne say that the sentence needs to be on the page before you consider the sentence, even if it's wrong. But then, Kevin Barry cautions that you can mistake fluency for inspiration very easily, which is great advice as well.
And a question there.
Hi there, I've really enjoyed both readings, and I just wanted to ask, given that you touched on the issue of drinking and Donal touched on, getting the voice of a young girl, have either of you ever got to a place in your writing where you got too afraid to go forward, where you just went, I'm not actually going to go there? I remember speaking to the screenwriter, Jimmy McGovern once. He wrote Hillsborough and wrote a lot of great TV stuff, and he was asked to write about the Jamie Bulger story, albeit fiction, and fiction is an act of imagination, as we know. And he just went, because I'm from Liverpool, it's such a Liverpool story and so tragic, even if I'm making it up, I can't go there. And I just wondered, do you ever turn back because you got too afraid of a theme or something?
Not that I know, but sometimes I do worry that I just do it without thinking about it. For instance, I read a lot of articles about serial killers. I find it really fascinating. But I never once tried to write about it, and I don't know whether that's just because it has nothing to do with my life, or the New England that I grew up with, so it would be terrible writing, and I kind of instinctively know that, or if I'm naturally afraid of that subject matter, and I've wondered about that with other things that I'm interested in, but I've never tried to write about.
Yeah, this is why one of the reasons I admire Stephen King so much, because there's literally nowhere he won't go. There's literally nothing he won't write about. And I'm a chicken, really. I'm a total chicken. Like I was writing for the novel I'm working on now, which is a scene where a child drowns, and actually I'm terrified of it. And I was thinking, okay, John Irving reckons if he writes about something, it won't happen to his family because it'd just be too much of a coincidence. So I'm trying to make myself think that as well, that if I write this, it won't happen to my Thomas, But I can't do it. I really literally can't. I'm halfway through it, and I can't get that scene written. I just can't, because I'm so terrified of that. You shouldn't be. See, as a writer, we need to be fearless, But I mean, it's hard. It takes work to become fearless.
Sorry.
Yes.
I would like to ask Sarah, what writers influence you? In particular, American writers influence you?
And as I'm about to say, the people that I always say, they're not American. Well, Alice Munro, I mentioned in the story, and Sebald, very much so. Those are the two that I usually mention. Carver gets brought up a lot with this book, and I do love Carver. And then, and so I grew up reading any books I could get my hands on. So most of the, Edith Wharton and all of from that era too.
Another question? Yes.
And when you emphasize, when you attempt to emphasize the character in the story, when you try to give them a voice, do you find you're more so appropriating their anguish, or are you kind of showing yours through them?
It's hard to say, really. Actually, it really is. If you question your kind of the source of what you write, it can become very confusing. And I mean, no one can know another person. person fully, you know. You can never know for a fact that somebody else exists, you know. There's no way of knowing this. So all you can do is try to imagine a scenario and how you would react yourself, really. So, I mean, you literally end up always writing about yourself. You know, it's a very selfish, narcissistic act. You're looking into the water all the time and seeing yourself. Because what else can you see? You can never know for sure. You know, fiction is just guessing. You're guessing all the time, I think.
And you?
Yeah, I like that question. I feel like a certain merging has to happen. Like I have a short story about a middle-aged man who abandons his daughter, and I could never be like, okay, there's a separate man, and I'm trying to think of how he'd respond. I think I have to just, it has to sort of be inside me, or else I think of a character as someone who I'd have to kind of, if there's a character that I'd have to really think about and understand is different, how would I bring him to life? I think I wouldn't be able to do it. But if I feel I can sort of merge towards that character as being something in me or something I can understand kind of innately, then I feel like I can write them.